What if I told you that we're inside your DNA right now? There's a ghost. Not a metaphor, not poetry, but an actual genetic signature left behind by someone who died 40,000 years ago. Someone who wasn't quite human, at least not in the way we think of ourselves today. Someone whose final breath echoed through caves that you will never see, whose last thoughts we will never know, but whose blood still runs through your veins. If you're of European, Asian, or Native American descent, between 1 and 4% of your genome comes from Neanderthals. That's not a small footnote in your ancestry. That's roughly 60 million base pairs of DNA that shouldn't exist if the story we tell ourselves about human evolution is true. Because according to the textbooks, Neanderthals went extinct. They lost. We won. End of story. But here's the thing about extinction. It's supposed to be final. When a species disappears, it takes its secrets with it. Yet somehow, 40,000 years after the last Neanderthal drew breath, they're still here. Still whispering in our genes. Still shaping who we are in ways we're only beginning to understand. Welcome to the most haunting mystery in human evolution, the 40,000-year enigma that rewrites everything we thought we knew about what it means to be human. I'm your host, and for the next several videos, we're going to dig into the strangest, most uncomfortable chapters of our species' history. The chapters that most documentaries skip over because they don't fit the neat narrative of human triumph. We're going to explore what really happened when our ancestors left Africa and encountered beings that were almost, but not quite, like them. We're going to examine evidence that suggests these meetings weren't always violent, that sometimes they were intimate, and that the consequences of those encounters are still unfolding in ways that scientists are only now beginning to grasp. But before we dive into the DNA evidence, before we reconstruct those final desperate years, when two human species shared the same caves, the same hunting grounds, the same uncertain future, we need to understand something crucial. This isn't just ancient history. This is personal, because every time you look in the mirror, you're looking at the face of a hybrid. A living, breathing testament to meetings that happened in the shadow of glaciers, in valleys that no longer exist, between people whose names we will never know. Let me paint you a picture. It's 45,000 years ago. The world is colder, stranger, more dangerous than anything you can imagine. Ice sheets stretch across northern Europe like frozen seas. Mammoths shake the ground with their footsteps. Cave lions prowl through forests that echo with sounds no human ear will ever hear again. And in this alien landscape, two kinds of people are trying to survive. One group has been here for hundreds of thousands of years. They've adapted to the cold, built tools from stone and bone, developed cultures we're only beginning to understand. They're stocky, powerful, with barrel chests designed for the thin air of Ice Age Europe. Their brains are actually larger than ours. These are the Neanderthals. The other group is newer, taller, more graceful, with darker skin that speaks of African origins. They've just arrived from the south, carrying with them new technologies, new ways of thinking, new forms of art and music. They're our direct ancestors, Homo Sapiens, us in other words, but living in a world we can barely comprehend. Now, for decades, scientists assumed these two groups were competitors, that when they met, it was with spears raised and territory contested. The Neanderthals were portrayed as brutish, primitive, doomed by their own limitations. Homo sapiens were the smart ones, the innovative ones, the ones destined to inherit the earth. But that story has a problem. If Neanderthals were so inferior, if the competition was so one-sided, why did it take our ancestors nearly 10,000 years to fully replace them? Why do we find Neanderthal tools becoming more sophisticated right around the time Homo sapiens arrived? And most puzzling of all, why do our genomes carry their signature? The answer is beginning to emerge from laboratories around the world, from ancient DNA extracted from bones that spent millennia frozen in cave sediments, from computer models that can trace genetic lineages back through thousands of generations. And what we are discovering is that the real story is far more complex, far more intimate and far more unsettling than anyone expected. These weren't just chance encounters between hostile tribes. These were sustained interactions that lasted for millennia. Interactions that involved trade, cultural exchange, and yes, interbreeding on a scale that fundamentally altered both species. We're not just the descendants of the winners in some prehistoric competition, we're the children of a merger. A biological treaty written in DNA between two kinds of human that were different enough to be separate species, but similar enough to create viable offspring. And here's where the story gets really strange, because it turns out that Neanderthal DNA didn't just hitchhike along for the ride in our genomes. It's been actively shaping us, influencing everything from our immune systems to our skin colour, from our response to pain to our risk of depression. Some Neanderthal genes have become more common in human populations over the past 40,000 years, suggesting they're actually beneficial. Others have been systematically eliminated, hinting at darker incompatibilities. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery is this. When scientists map where Neanderthal DNA is most concentrated in modern human genomes, one region stands out: the brain, specifically genes involved in brain development, cognition, and neurological function. Whatever happened between our species 40,000 years ago, it didn't just change our bodies, it changed our minds. Think about that for a moment. Every thought you've ever had, every emotion you felt, every creative impulse that makes you uniquely human, it's all been shaped by neural architecture that's part Neanderthal. When you solve a complex problem, when you create art, when you love someone so intensely it hurts, you're using cognitive machinery that was forged in the genetic fires of interspecies mixing. This raises questions that go to the very heart of what it means to be human. Are we really a single species, or are we something more complex, a hybrid lineage that carries the biological memories of multiple human populations? And if our minds are partly Neanderthal, what does that say about consciousness itself? About the nature of intelligence, creativity, emotion? Scientists are only beginning to tackle these questions, but the implications are staggering. We're discovering that human evolution didn't end when we left Africa. It accelerated, and much of that acceleration was driven by the genetic contributions of people we once dismissed as evolutionary dead ends. But here's what really keeps researchers up at night. Neanderthals weren't the only other humans our ancestors encountered. As they spread across Asia, they met the Denisovans, another mysterious human lineage, known mainly from DNA extracted from a single finger bone. They mixed with them too, and there are hints in our genomes of other encounters, other meetings with human populations that have vanished so completely we don't even have names for them. How many different kinds of humans were there? How many times did our ancestors interbreed with populations that were genetically distinct, enough to be considered separate species? And what happened to all that diversity? Why are we the only human lineage left? The more we learn about our genetic heritage, the more complex and troubling the picture becomes. Because it turns out that being human isn't simple. It's not a single thread running from ancient Africa to the modern world. It's a braided rope, woven from multiple lineages, multiple populations, multiple ways of being human that have been lost to time. And that brings us to the central enigma that will drive this entire series. If interbreeding between human species was so common, if it was so beneficial that we still carry those genes today, why did all the other human lineages disappear? What happened in those final millennia when Neanderthals, Denisovans, and who knows how many other human populations vanished from the Earth, leaving only us? Was it climate change? Disease? Competition for resources? Or was it something darker? Something about the nature of human expansion itself that made coexistence impossible even as our genes continued to mingle? The answer to that question isn't just academic, because if we can understand what drove the great human extinctions of the past, maybe we can understand something crucial about ourselves, about our capacity for both cooperation and destruction, about what happens when different populations of the same species compete for the same planet. In the next part of this series, we're going to dive deep into the DNA evidence. We're going to explore exactly how scientists can extract genetic information from bones that are tens of thousands of years old, and what that information reveals about the intimate encounters between our ancestors and their Neanderthal neighbours. We'll visit the caves where these meetings took place, examine the tools and artefacts left behind, and try to reconstruct what daily life might have looked like when multiple human species shared the same landscape. We'll explore the latest research on Neanderthal cognition, culture, and behaviour, and ask whether the differences between them and us were really as profound as we once believed. But most importantly, we'll confront the uncomfortable truth that emerges from all this evidence, that the story of human evolution isn't a triumph of the superior over the inferior, it's a tragedy of loss, a chronicle of diversity that was narrowed down to a single, surviving lineage, through processes we're still trying to understand. Because here's the thing about ghosts, they don't just haunt houses, they haunt histories, they haunt the spaces between what we know and what we can never know. And the Neanderthal ghost in your DNA is whispering questions that go to the very heart of what makes us human. What did those final encounters actually look like? Picture this, a small band of Homo Sapiens, maybe 20 individuals, making their way through a river valley in what we now call Croatia. It's autumn, 43,000 years ago. The air carries the bite of an approaching winter that will be harsher than anything their African ancestors ever endured. They're following game trails looking for shelter when they smell wood smoke drifting through the trees. They're not alone. The smoke leads them to a cave mouth where the embers of a carefully tended fire still glow. Around it, the evidence of another kind of human. Stone tools, but crafted in a style they've never seen. Animal bones, cracked open to extract marrow with techniques that are foreign yet familiar. And then emerging from the deeper recesses of the cave, the Neanderthals themselves. Now Hollywood would have you believe this moment exploded into violence, spears flying, territory defended, the weak eliminated by the strong. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story, a stranger story. Because what we find in sites across Europe isn't the aftermath of war. It's the debris of coexistence. At Grotte du Renne in France, we discover layers of sediment that contain both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens artifacts, mixed together like the remnants of a shared meal. At Willendorf in Austria, we find evidence that both species used the same caves, sometimes within decades of each other, sometimes simultaneously. The stone tools begin to blur together, Neanderthal techniques influencing Homo sapiens craftsmanship, and vice versa. This isn't conquest, this is collaboration, or at least accommodation. But here's where the mystery deepens, because while some encounters clearly led to peaceful coexistence, others tell a darker tale. At sites like Krapina in Croatia, we find Neanderthal bones bearing cut marks that suggest something far more sinister, evidence of processing, of deliberate butchery that raises the spectre of cannibalism. Were these Neanderthals killed by other Neanderthals, by Homo sapiens, or was this simply how both species dealt with their dead in times of extreme hardship? The bones can't tell us about the emotions involved. They can't reveal whether these encounters were driven by desperation, hatred, or simple survival pragmatism. But they can tell us something equally important, that the boundary between cooperation and competition was razor thin, and that our ancestors lived constantly on that edge. And then there's the DNA evidence, which paints perhaps the most complex picture of all. Because when geneticists analyse the Neanderthal genes scattered throughout modern human genomes, they don't find random distribution. Instead, they discover clear patterns that reveal something profound about those ancient encounters. The Neanderthal DNA in your genome isn't evenly spread. It clusters in specific regions, as if natural selection has been actively shaping it for tens of thousands of years. Some Neanderthal genes have become incredibly common in certain populations, reaching frequencies of 50% or higher. These are genes that clearly provided some advantage, some benefit, that helped our ancestors survive in their new environment. What kind of advantages? Well, many of them relate to immune function. Neanderthal genes helped Homo sapiens fight off diseases they'd never encountered before. Pathogens that had co-evolved with European populations for hundreds of thousands of years. In a very real sense, interbreeding with Neanderthals was like receiving a biological vaccination against the diseases of a new continent. Other Neanderthal genes influence skin pigmentation, helping populations adapt to the reduced sunlight of northern latitudes. Still others affect blood clotting, pain sensitivity, even fat metabolism. Each one represents a solution to an environmental challenge that our African ancestors had never faced. But here's the disturbing part. While some Neanderthal genes have been preserved and even amplified by natural selection, others have been systematically purged from the human genome. These are genes that were apparently so harmful, so incompatible with Homo sapiens biology, that they've been almost entirely eliminated despite 40,000 years of genetic mixing. What were these toxic genes? Many of them relate to male fertility. Neanderthal genes that ended up on the X chromosome seem to have caused sterility or reduced reproductive success in male offspring. This suggests that while interbreeding between the species was possible, it came with significant biological costs. The hybrid offspring weren't always viable, weren't always fertile, weren't always capable of continuing the genetic line. This paints a picture of encounters that were simultaneously beneficial and destructive. Beneficial enough that they provided crucial advantages to Homo sapiens populations expanding into new environments, destructive enough that they carried genetic incompatibilities that took millennia to resolve. But the most unsettling discoveries come from studying Neanderthal genes that influence brain function, because it turns out that many of the Neanderthal genetic variants that have been preserved in modern humans affect neurological development, cognitive function, and mental health. Some of these variants influence autism spectrum disorders. Others affect schizophrenia risk, depression susceptibility, even addiction potential. The Neanderthal contribution to human cognition wasn't uniformly positive or negative. It was complex, adding layers of neurological diversity that we're still trying to understand. This raises profound questions about the nature of human consciousness. Are the voices in your head partly Neanderthal? When you experience depression, anxiety, or obsessive thoughts, are you experiencing echoes of a different kind of human mind? When you display exceptional focus, pattern recognition, or systematic thinking, are you drawing on cognitive architecture that was forged in Ice Age Europe by a species that no longer exists? The more we learn about Neanderthal neurology, the more these questions become not just scientific curiosities, but deeply personal inquiries into the nature of our own minds. Recent studies have identified specific Neanderthal genes that influence brain size, neural connectivity, and even the structure of the skull that houses our brain. One variant affects the growth of the parietal lobe, a region crucial for spatial reasoning and tool use. Another influences the development of the cerebellum, which plays key roles in language processing and social cognition. Most remarkably, some Neanderthal genes seem to influence creativity itself. Variants that affect dopamine regulation, pattern recognition, and cognitive flexibility. These are the genes that might determine whether you see art in a sunset, whether you can solve complex problems through intuitive leaps, whether you're driven to create something that has never existed before. If this is true, then every human artistic achievement, every scientific breakthrough, every moment of creative inspiration carries within it the ghost of Neanderthal cognition. We're not just genetically hybrid, we're cognitively hybrid. Our minds are the product of a merger between two different ways of being conscious, two different approaches to processing reality. But this raises an even more troubling question. If Neanderthal genes contributed so much to human survival, adaptation, and cognitive diversity, why did the Neanderthals themselves disappear? Why are we studying their contributions through fragments of DNA rather than through living populations? The answer to that question takes us into some of the darkest chapters of human prehistory. Because while interbreeding clearly occurred, while genetic exchange clearly benefited both species, something went catastrophically wrong. Something that resulted in the complete disappearance of Neanderthal populations across their entire range, from Spain to Siberia, within a relatively short period of time. Climate change played a role. The period between 40 and 30,000 years ago saw dramatic shifts in temperature and precipitation that would have stressed all human populations, but Neanderthals had survived previous climate upheavals. They'd endured ice ages, warm periods, volcanic eruptions. They were supremely adapted to environmental instability. Disease might have been a factor. When populations that have been separated for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly come into contact, they exchange pathogens as well as genes. Homo sapiens might have brought diseases from Africa that Neanderthal immune systems couldn't handle, or the process might have worked in reverse, with Neanderthal diseases devastating Homo sapiens populations. But there's another possibility, one that's harder to confront, but impossible to ignore. Competition. Not the simple territorial disputes that characterize most animal interactions, but something more complex and more devastating. Competition, not just for resources, but for ecological niches, for cultural space, for the right to define what it means to be human. Because here's what the archaeological record shows us. As Homo sapiens populations expanded across Europe, Neanderthal populations contracted, not gradually, not peacefully, but in a pattern that suggests systematic displacement. Neanderthal sites become fewer and farther between. Their artifacts become less sophisticated, their populations smaller and more isolated. This doesn't necessarily mean direct warfare, though evidence of violence certainly exists. It might mean something subtler, but equally deadly: economic competition. If Homo sapiens were more efficient hunters, more effective tool makers, more successful at extracting resources from the environment, they might have simply outcompeted Neanderthals for the necessities of life. Over thousands of years, this kind of competition could have gradually pushed Neanderthal populations into smaller and smaller refuges until they reached a point where genetic diversity was too low, population sizes too small, and environmental pressures too great to sustain the species. The final Neanderthal populations seem to have survived in isolated pockets: the mountains of Spain, the islands of the Mediterranean, the remote valleys of the Caucasus. These were the last holdouts, clinging to existence in marginal environments, while Homo sapiens dominated the prime real estate. And then, around 28,000 years ago, even these final refuges fell silent. What happened in those last millennia? Did the final Neanderthals know they were the last? Did they understand that their way of life, their culture, their entire lineage was coming to an end? Or did they simply live each day as their ancestors had, hunting and gathering and raising children, unaware that they were writing the final chapters of a story that had lasted for hundreds of thousands of years? We'll never know their thoughts, their fears, their hopes, but we do know this: they didn't disappear without a trace. They live on in us, in the genes that shape our bodies and minds, in the DNA that carries forward their biological legacy, even as their cultural legacy faded into silence. This is the part of the story that makes scientists uncomfortable. Because when we dig deeper into the genetic evidence, when we map out exactly when and where these encounters took place, we discover something that challenges everything we think we know about human nature. The interbreeding wasn't random, it wasn't opportunistic, it was systematic, repeated, and geographically widespread. From the Altai Mountains of Siberia to the caves of Gibraltar, from the forests of Germany to the steppes of Central Asia, we find the same genetic signature. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals didn't just meet occasionally at territorial boundaries. They lived together, worked together, and created families together for thousands of years. But here's where the story takes a turn that most documentaries won't touch, because the genetic evidence reveals something else, something that speaks to the complexity of these relationships. The flow of genes wasn't equal in both directions. When scientists analyze the X chromosomes in modern human populations, they find almost no Neanderthal contribution. The X chromosome is passed down through the maternal line, which means that while Neanderthal men were clearly fathering children with Homo sapiens women, the reverse was much less common. Homo sapiens men weren't having children with Neanderthal women, at least not children who survived to reproduce. What does this tell us? It suggests that these weren't partnerships between equals. The genetic evidence points to a pattern that's uncomfortable to acknowledge: Neanderthal males integrating into Homo sapiens groups, while Neanderthal females remained largely within their own populations. This could indicate several things. Perhaps Homo sapiens groups practiced a form of patrilocal residence, where women moved to join their husband's group, making it easier for Neanderthal men to integrate. Perhaps there were cultural barriers that made the reverse arrangement difficult or impossible, or perhaps something darker was at play. Perhaps these weren't always consensual encounters. The genetic data can't tell us about emotions, about power dynamics, about consent, but it can tell us about outcomes, and the outcomes suggest that whatever was happening between these species, it was asymmetrical in ways that had lasting biological consequences. Consider what this means for our understanding of those ancient encounters. A Neanderthal man joining a Homo sapiens group would have had to learn new languages, new customs, new ways of making tools and hunting prey. He would have been perpetually foreign, his children carrying visible markers of their mixed heritage. How were these individuals treated? Were they welcomed as valuable contributors, bringing knowledge of local environments and survival techniques? Or were they tolerated outsiders, always on the margins of the group? And what about the children? Modern genetics shows us that many of the hybrid offspring must have been healthy and fertile, since their genes persist in our populations today. But it also shows us that many others carried genetic incompatibilities that reduced their fitness, their ability to survive and reproduce. Imagine being one of these hybrid children, growing up in a world where you didn't quite fit either category, too different from your Homo sapiens relatives to be fully accepted, too removed from Neanderthal populations to find belonging there. Your physical features marking you as other, your cognitive patterns perhaps following different rhythms than those around you. These children were living experiments in human diversity, carrying within their bodies the biological record of meetings between lineages that had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. Some of them thrived, contributing genes that still help us fight diseases and adapt to new environments. Others struggled with genetic incompatibilities that we're only now beginning to understand. But here's what's truly remarkable about this story. Despite all the challenges, despite the genetic incompatibilities and cultural barriers, the interbreeding continued for millennia. Generation after generation, individuals from both species chose to cross the boundaries that separated them. They formed relationships, created families, and raised children in a world that must have been filled with uncertainty about what those children's futures would hold. This persistence suggests something profound about human nature, that even when faced with the unknown, even when crossing boundaries that evolution had spent hundreds of thousands of years creating, our ancestors were driven by something stronger than fear. Whether it was love, curiosity, necessity, or simple proximity, they kept reaching across the divide that separated one kind of human from another, and the consequences of those choices ripple through time in ways that continue to surprise us. Recent studies have identified Neanderthal genes that influence everything from our circadian rhythms to our response to sunlight. Variants that affect how our skin produces vitamin D, how our bodies regulate sleep cycles, even how we process certain nutrients. Some of these genes are more common in populations that live at northern latitudes, where the low-angle sunlight and long winter nights would have posed significant challenges to African evolved physiology. The Neanderthal contributions weren't just helpful, they were essential for survival in these new environments. Other Neanderthal genes influence our immune systems in ways that are still being discovered. Variants that help us fight off specific viruses, bacteria, and parasites that our ancestors would have encountered as they spread across Europe and Asia. In some cases, these immune system genes have become so important that they're found in nearly 100% of certain populations. This raises a fascinating question about human expansion and adaptation. How much of our success as a species depended not just on our own innovations, but on the biological knowledge encoded in the genomes of the populations we encountered? Were we successful colonizers because we were inherently superior, or because we were effective borrowers, incorporating the best adaptations from multiple human lineages? The evidence increasingly points toward the latter explanation. Human expansion wasn't a story of conquest and replacement. It was a story of integration and synthesis. We didn't succeed by eliminating other human populations. We succeeded by absorbing them, by incorporating their genetic wisdom into our own biological toolkit. But this success came at a cost that we're only now beginning to calculate. Because while we gained valuable genes from our encounters with other human species, we also lost something irreplaceable. We lost the diversity that comes from having multiple human lineages adapting to different environments in different ways. Think about what the world might have looked like if Neanderthals had survived as a distinct population. Their robust physiology was perfectly adapted to cold climates. Their large brains and different cognitive patterns might have led to innovations we can't even imagine. Their cultural traditions, their ways of understanding and interacting with the world represented hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about how to be human in Ice Age Europe. All of that knowledge, all of that diversity, all of those different ways of being human vanished when the last Neanderthal died. What we gained in genetic integration, we lost in cultural and biological diversity. And Neanderthals weren't the only loss. As Homo Sapiens spread across Asia, they encountered the Denisovans, another human lineage that contributed significantly to our genetic heritage, particularly in populations that eventually reached Oceania. Denisovan genes help modern Tibetans survive at high altitudes, processing oxygen more efficiently in the thin air of the world's highest mountains. But like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans themselves disappeared, leaving behind only genetic fragments and a few tantalizing bone fragments in a Siberian cave. We know almost nothing about their culture, their cognition, their way of life. They exist for us only as statistical patterns in genetic databases. How many other human lineages did our ancestors encounter and absorb? The genetic evidence suggests there were others, ghost populations that contributed DNA to modern humans but left no fossil record, no archaeological traces, no names. They exist only as unexplained genetic variants that don't match any known human population. Each of these encounters represented a meeting between different experiments in being human, different solutions to the challenges of survival, different approaches to cognition and culture, different ways of understanding what it means to be conscious in a complex world. And each disappearance represented a narrowing of possibilities, a reduction in the range of ways that human consciousness could express itself. We became the sole survivors, not because we were the best solution to the puzzle of human existence, but because we were the most successful at incorporating other solutions into ourselves. This realization should humble us, because it suggests that our dominance as a species wasn't the result of our individual superiority, but of our collective ability to synthesize the best traits from multiple human lineages. We are successful not because we are pure, but because we are hybrid. But it should also concern us, because if human history teaches us anything, it's that diversity is valuable not just for its own sake, but for the resilience it provides in the face of unexpected challenges. The genetic diversity we inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans has helped us survive diseases, adapt to new environments, and thrive in conditions our African ancestors never encountered. What challenges might we face in the future that would benefit from even greater human diversity? What problems might we solve more effectively if we had access to the cognitive patterns of Neanderthals, the physiological adaptations of Denisovans, the unknown capabilities of those ghost populations whose genes we carry but whose identities we've forgotten? We'll never know, because those experiments in being human are over. We ended them, not through deliberate genocide, but through the slower, more complex process of absorption and replacement that characterized human expansion across the globe. The ghosts in our DNA are all that remains of a time when humanity was more diverse, more experimental, more open to different ways of being conscious. They remind us that our current form of humanity isn't the inevitable endpoint of evolution, but simply the one that happened to survive. And that survival came with the responsibilities we're only now beginning to understand. Because if we carry the genetic legacy of multiple human lineages, if our success depended on the wisdom accumulated by populations that no longer exist, then we also carry the obligation to use that legacy wisely. The Neanderthal genes that help us fight diseases, the Denisovan variants that help us survive at altitude, the unknown contributions from ghost populations that helped us adapt to environments across the globe. These aren't just interesting footnotes in our evolutionary history. They're tools in our biological toolkit, resources that we inherited from lineages that paid the ultimate price for our success. The question that haunts researchers working on human genetics isn't just what these genes do, but what we owe to the populations that gave them to us. How do we honour the memory of human lineages that exist now only as fragments scattered through our genomes? How do we acknowledge that our success came not from our own brilliance, but from our ability to incorporate the brilliance of others? These aren't just academic questions, they're deeply personal ones. Because every time you use Neanderthal-influenced cognition to solve a problem, every time Denisovan genes help your body adapt to a new environment, every time ghost population variants contribute to your survival, you're drawing on a biological inheritance that came at the cost of entire ways of being human. The 40,000-year Enigma isn't just about what happened when different human species met. It's about what we lost when those meetings ended with absorption rather than coexistence. It's about recognizing that human diversity was once far greater than anything we see today, and that our current form of humanity represents not the triumph of the best, but the survival of the most successful incorporators. The story becomes even stranger when we examine the timeline of these extinctions, because they didn't happen randomly. They followed a pattern, a wave of disappearances that tracked almost perfectly with the expansion of Homo Sapiens across the globe. In Europe, Neanderthals vanished within 10,000 years of our arrival. In Asia, Denisovan populations disappeared around the same time modern humans reached their territories. On remote islands across the Pacific, unique human populations that had evolved in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years went extinct shortly after the first boats arrived carrying our ancestors. This pattern is so consistent, so geographically widespread, that it can't be coincidence. Something about the expansion of Homo sapiens was systematically fatal to other human lineages. But what? The traditional explanation focuses on competition. We were smarter, more adaptable, better at extracting resources from the environment. We outcompeted other human species the same way any successful species might displace its rivals. It's a clean narrative that fits comfortably with our understanding of natural selection and evolutionary success. But the genetic evidence complicates this story in ways that make scientists deeply uncomfortable. Because if we were simply outcompeting other human species, why was there so much interbreeding? Why do we find clear evidence of sustained genetic exchange over thousands of years? Competition and cooperation don't usually go hand in hand. When species are truly competing for the same ecological niche, they tend to avoid each other, not interbreed. The fact that genetic mixing was so widespread suggests something far more complex than simple territorial displacement. Recent archaeological discoveries have begun to flesh out this complexity. At sites across Europe, we find evidence that Neanderthals and Homo Sapiens weren't just occasionally encountering each other at territorial boundaries. They were living in the same regions, using the same resources, even occupying the same caves, sometimes simultaneously. At the Grotte du Renne in France, layers of sediment reveal a remarkable story. Neanderthal artifacts appear alongside the earliest Homo sapiens tools in Europe. But these aren't just random associations. The Neanderthal tools from these layers show clear influence from Homo sapiens techniques. Stone points become more refined. Bone tools appear for the first time in Neanderthal assemblages. Even decorative objects, beads and pendants, that were previously unknown in Neanderthal culture begin to appear. This isn't the archaeological signature of competition. It's the signature of cultural exchange. Neanderthals weren't just coexisting with the newcomers. They were learning from them, adopting their innovations, integrating their techniques into traditional ways of life. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. Because this cultural flourishing, this evidence of learning and adaptation, appears in the very latest Neanderthal sites. The most sophisticated Neanderthal tools, the clearest evidence of cultural exchange, the strongest signs of behavioural flexibility, all cluster in the final millennia before their disappearance. It's as if Neanderthals were desperately trying to adapt, to incorporate new technologies and behaviours that might help them survive in a world that was rapidly changing around them. They were innovating, learning, evolving their culture at an unprecedented pace. And yet, despite all these efforts, they still went extinct. This pattern suggests something profoundly troubling about the nature of human expansion. It wasn't that other human species were incapable of change or adaptation. They were changing, sometimes rapidly and dramatically. But change wasn't enough. Even when they successfully incorporated new technologies and behaviours, even when they demonstrated remarkable behavioural flexibility, they still couldn't survive the encounter with Homo sapiens. What does this tell us about the true nature of that encounter? The genetic evidence shows us that interbreeding was common and beneficial. The archaeological evidence shows us that cultural exchange was real and productive. Yet despite all this apparent cooperation, one species thrived while the others vanished. The answer might lie not in what these species were doing, but in how many of them there were. Because while we focus on the interactions between different human lineages, we often overlook the most fundamental difference between them: population size. When Homo sapiens first expanded out of Africa, they weren't just carrying new technologies and behaviours, they were carrying demographic momentum. Our species had already undergone significant population growth in Africa, developing the social structures and cultural practices that could support larger, more complex communities. Neanderthals, by contrast, seem to have lived in smaller, more dispersed populations throughout their history. Their total population across all of Europe and Western Asia might never have exceeded a few tens of thousands of individuals. When Homo sapiens arrived with larger group sizes, more complex social networks, and higher reproductive rates, the demographic imbalance was overwhelming. In this scenario, interbreeding, and cultural exchange weren't signs of peaceful coexistence. They were signs of absorption. Smaller Neanderthal populations were being gradually incorporated into larger Homo sapiens communities, contributing their genes and knowledge, but losing their distinct identity in the process. Over time, this demographic absorption would have led to exactly the pattern we see in the genetic record. Significant Neanderthal contributions to the Homo sapiens gene pool, but no surviving Neanderthal populations. The species didn't go extinct through violence or competition. It went extinct through integration, dissolved into the expanding wave of modern human demographics. But this explanation, while mathematically elegant, raises even more disturbing questions about human nature, because if demographic absorption was the primary mechanism of Neanderthal extinction, then what we're really talking about is cultural genocide. Not the violent elimination of a population, but the systematic erasure of their distinct way of life through overwhelming demographic pressure. The Neanderthals, who contributed genes to our ancestors, weren't just individuals who happened to interbreed with Homo sapiens. They were the survivors of communities that were being gradually overwhelmed, people who had no choice but to integrate into expanding modern human populations, or face complete isolation and eventual extinction. Think about what this means for our understanding of those ancient encounters. A Neanderthal woman whose children carry forward her genetic legacy into the modern human gene pool wasn't necessarily choosing to join a Homo sapiens community. She might have been the last member of her own community, forced to seek refuge with the only other humans available as her traditional way of life collapsed around her. The genetic contributions that we celebrate today as evidence of successful interspecies cooperation might actually represent the final desperate attempts of dying populations to ensure some form of biological continuity, even if their cultural continuity was impossible. This interpretation casts the entire story of human expansion in a different light. We weren't successful because we were better adapted or more intelligent than other human species. We were successful because we had achieved a critical mass of population and social organization that made us essentially unstoppable once we began expanding. Other human species weren't inferior. They were simply outnumbered. And in a world where demographic momentum determines survival, being outnumbered is often fatal, regardless of individual capabilities or cultural sophistication. But here's what makes this story even more complex. The demographic advantage that allowed Homo sapiens to absorb other human populations didn't come from nowhere. It was built on innovations in social organization, resource extraction, and cultural transmission that had been developing for tens of thousands of years in Africa. While Neanderthals were perfecting their adaptation to Ice Age Europe, Homo sapiens populations in Africa were experimenting with new forms of social complexity. They were developing more sophisticated tools, more efficient hunting techniques, more effective ways of processing and storing food. They were creating art, music, and symbolic systems that could bind larger groups together and transmit knowledge more effectively across generations. By the time Homo sapiens began expanding out of Africa, they weren't just carrying individual innovations. They were carrying an entire cultural and demographic system that had been optimized for growth and expansion. They were, in effect, a different kind of human society, one that was structured for success in the kind of competitive encounters they would face as they spread across the globe. This gives us a new way of understanding the 40,000-year enigma. The question isn't why Homo sapiens succeeded while other human species failed. The question is why Homo sapiens developed the particular combination of cultural, technological, and demographic innovations that made them so successful at absorbing other populations. What was happening in Africa during the hundreds of thousands of years before the Great Expansion? What pressures, what opportunities, what accidents of history led to the development of the cultural toolkit that would eventually prove so devastating to human diversity worldwide? The answer to that question takes us deep into the African origins of our species, into the environmental and social pressures that shaped our ancestors long before they ever encountered a Neanderthal. It takes us into the story of how a particular population of early humans developed the characteristics that would eventually make them the sole survivors of what was once a much more diverse human family. But it also takes us into uncomfortable territory about the nature of cultural evolution and the price of success. Because if our dominance came from developing more effective ways of absorbing other populations, then we need to reckon with what that means for our understanding of human nature and human history. The genes we inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans aren't just biological gifts that helped us adapt to new environments. They're also the molecular remnants of entire ways of being human that we systematically eliminated through our success. Every beneficial variant we carry is also a memorial to a population that no longer exists, a lineage that was absorbed into our own and lost its independent existence in the process. This realization should change how we think about human diversity, both past and present. Because if our history is one of absorption rather than coexistence, if our success came from eliminating alternatives rather than preserving them, then we need to be much more intentional about protecting the diversity that remains. The 40,000-year enigma isn't just about what happened to the Neanderthals. It's about what happens when one human population becomes so successful at expansion that it eliminates all alternatives. It's about the paradox of a species that succeeded through diversity absorption, but then found itself alone in a world it had emptied of other forms of human consciousness. And that brings us to the most haunting aspect of this entire story, because we're not just the inheritors of Neanderthal and Denisovan genes, we're also the inheritors of the demographic and cultural systems that made their absorption possible. The same innovations that allowed our ancestors to successfully integrate other human populations are still with us, still shaping how we interact with diversity, still influencing how we respond to encounters with different ways of being human. The ghosts in our DNA aren't just genetic variants that influence our biology, they're also cultural memories, embedded patterns of behaviour that reflect our species' long history of successful absorption, and those patterns continue to shape us in ways we're only beginning to understand. When we encounter human populations that are culturally or genetically distinct from ourselves, when we face the choice between coexistence and integration, when we must decide whether diversity should be preserved or absorbed, we're drawing on behavioural tendencies that were forged in the Ice Age encounters between our ancestors and their human relatives. The 40,000-year enigma isn't ancient history, it's ongoing, because the same demographic and cultural forces that led to the absorption of Neanderthal and Denisovan populations are still operating today, still shaping human encounters, still determining which forms of human diversity survive and which disappear into the expanding mainstream of global culture. The question that haunts geneticists and anthropologists isn't just what happened to the Neanderthals, it's whether we're still doing it, whether the cultural and demographic momentum that made us so successful at absorbing other human species is still driving us to eliminate diversity in favour of integration, to choose absorption over coexistence, to prioritise expansion over preservation. And if we are still doing it, if the 40,000-year enigma is still playing out in the modern world, then understanding what happened to the Neanderthals becomes more than an academic exercise. It becomes a mirror, reflecting back to us the true nature of our success as a species and the price that success has always demanded. Because the ghosts in our DNA aren't just reminders of what we gained from our encounters with other human species, they're also reminders of what we lost. And they're warnings about what we might still be losing every time we choose integration over coexistence, absorption over preservation, the comfort of sameness over the challenge of true diversity. The Neanderthals are gone, the Denisovans are gone, the The ghost populations whose genes we carry but whose names we never knew are gone. We are alone now in a way that no human species has ever been alone, carrying within our bodies the genetic memories of lineages we ourselves eliminated. And the question that will determine our future is whether we can learn from those memories, whether we can honour the diversity we destroyed, whether we can find ways to preserve the human differences that remain before they too become nothing more than statistical patterns in genetic databases. The 40,000-year enigma isn't just about the past, it's about who we choose to be going forward, armed with the knowledge of what we're capable of and the responsibility that knowledge brings. The implications of what we've discovered extend far beyond ancient history, because when we map the geographic distribution of Neanderthal genes in modern populations, we see something remarkable. These genes aren't randomly scattered across human populations. They cluster in specific regions, reach different frequencies in different groups, and tell a story about migration patterns, adaptation, and survival that continues to unfold today. In northern European populations, certain Neanderthal variants reach frequencies of over 50%. These are genes that clearly provided massive advantages for survival in cold, low-light environments. They influence everything from vitamin D synthesis to cold tolerance, from immune function to seasonal mood regulation. Without these Neanderthal contributions, it's unlikely that Homo Sapiens could have successfully colonized the northern reaches of Europe and Asia. But here's where the story becomes deeply personal for millions of people alive today. Because those same Neanderthal genes that provided survival advantages in Ice Age Europe also influence modern health in ways that scientists are only beginning to understand. Some Neanderthal variants increase the risk of certain autoimmune disorders. Others influence depression susceptibility, particularly seasonal affective disorder. Still others affect pain sensitivity, addiction potential, even the likelihood of developing certain types of cancer. The genetic gifts that helped our ancestors survive in a harsh prehistoric world sometimes become burdens in the context of modern life. This creates a strange paradox. The very genes that we can thank for our existence as northern populations also contribute to health challenges that affect millions of people today. We are literally living with the biological consequences of encounters that happened 40,000 years ago in bodies that carry both the benefits and the costs of our hybrid heritage. But perhaps the most profound discovery comes from studying how Neanderthal genes influence cognition in modern populations. Because it turns out that some of the strongest signals of Neanderthal ancestry occur in genes that affect brain development, neural connectivity, and information processing. Recent studies have identified Neanderthal variants that influence autism spectrum disorders, not by causing them, but by contributing to the cognitive patterns we associate with systematic thinking, attention to detail, and pattern recognition. Other variants affect working memory, spatial reasoning, and the ability to process complex visual information. This suggests something extraordinary about the nature of human consciousness. We're not just genetically hybrid, we're cognitively hybrid. The way you think, the way you process information, the way you perceive and interact with the world around you has been shaped by neural architecture that includes Neanderthal contributions. When you become completely absorbed in a complex task, when you notice patterns that others miss, when you approach problems with systematic precision, you may be drawing on cognitive capabilities that were refined in Ice Age Europe by minds that belong to a different human species. This realization forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about intelligence, creativity, and human potential. If our cognitive abilities are the product of mixing between different human lineages, if our mental strengths come from incorporating diverse forms of neural architecture, then what does this say about the value of cognitive diversity more broadly? The Neanderthal contributions to human cognition weren't uniformly positive or negative. They added complexity, created trade-offs, introduced new capabilities alongside new vulnerabilities, but they also expanded the range of ways that human consciousness can express itself, broadening the spectrum of cognitive styles and information processing approaches available to our species. And this brings us to one of the most unsettling implications of the genetic evidence. Because if cognitive diversity was enhanced by mixing between human species, if our mental capabilities were strengthened by incorporating different forms of neural architecture, then what did we lose when those other species disappeared? The Neanderthals had larger brains than modern humans. Their neural architecture was different from ours in ways that we're still trying to understand. Their approach to problem solving, their methods of information processing, their ways of perceiving and interacting with the world represented hundreds of thousands of years of independent cognitive evolution. When the last Neanderthal died, all of that cognitive diversity vanished. We retained fragments of it in our genes, but we lost the full expression of Neanderthal consciousness, the complete range of their mental capabilities, the integrated system of cognition that had been refined over millennia of adaptation to Ice Age environments. The same is true for the Denisovans and the ghost populations whose genetic contributions we carry, but whose cognitive characteristics we can only guess at. Each extinction reduced the range of ways that human consciousness could express itself, narrowed the spectrum of mental approaches available to our species. We became cognitively poorer even as we became genetically richer. We incorporated the best fragments of other human minds while losing access to their complete expression. And we have no way of knowing what problems we might solve more effectively, what insights we might achieve, what creative breakthroughs we might accomplish if we had access to the full range of human cognitive diversity that once existed. This loss becomes even more poignant when we consider the environmental challenges facing our species today. Climate change, resource depletion, social complexity, technological disruption. These are exactly the kinds of challenges that might benefit from diverse approaches to problem solving, from multiple ways of processing information and generating solutions. The Neanderthal mind, with its different neural architecture and alternative cognitive patterns, might have approached these problems in ways that complement our own thinking. The Denisovan brain, adapted to different environments and challenges, might have contributed insights that we're incapable of generating on our own. But we'll never know, because those forms of human consciousness no longer exist. We eliminated them through our success, absorbed them into our own populations, and reduced the cognitive diversity of our species to a single surviving lineage. And yet, the fragments remain. In the genes that influence how we think, in the neural variants that shape our information processing, in the cognitive patterns that we've inherited from populations that no longer exist. These fragments are still active, still influencing human thought and creativity, still contributing to our species' problem-solving capabilities. The question facing us now is whether we can learn to recognize and value these contributions, whether we can understand that our cognitive abilities aren't the product of a single evolutionary lineage, but the result of mixing between multiple forms of human consciousness. Whether we can appreciate that our mental strengths come not from purity, but from diversity. Because if we can learn to see ourselves as cognitive hybrids, if we can recognize that our thinking abilities were enhanced by incorporating different forms of neural architecture, then we might also learn to value the cognitive diversity that still exists within our species. The same processes that created beneficial mixing between ancient human species are still operating today. Different human populations, shaped by different environments and evolutionary pressures, have developed subtle but significant differences in cognitive patterns, information processing styles, and problem-solving approaches. These differences aren't about intelligence or capability. They're about diversity of approach, variety of perspective, alternative ways of organizing and processing information. And just as the mixing between ancient human species enhanced our cognitive capabilities, the preservation and integration of modern cognitive diversity might be crucial for our species' future success. But we're at risk of losing this diversity through the same processes that eliminated the Neanderthals and Denisovans. Globalization, cultural homogenization, and demographic absorption are reducing the range of cognitive approaches available to our species, just as they once reduced the number of human lineages. The 40,000-year enigma isn't just about what happened to our ancient relatives. It's about what's happening to human diversity right now, in our own time, through our own choices. We're still the same species that successfully absorbed multiple human lineages, still carrying the same demographic and cultural momentum that made us so effective at eliminating alternatives. The difference is that now we have the knowledge to recognize what we're doing. We understand the value of the diversity we've lost, the cognitive capabilities we've eliminated, the alternative forms of human consciousness that no longer exist. We know what absorption costs even when it provides short-term benefits. This knowledge comes with responsibility, because if we understand how our species succeeded in the past, if we recognize the patterns that led to the elimination of other human lineages, then we also have the opportunity to make different choices going forward. We can choose to preserve cognitive diversity rather than absorb it. We can choose to maintain alternative approaches to problem solving rather than homogenize them. We can choose to value different ways of thinking rather than eliminate them in favor of dominant patterns. The ghosts in our DNA aren't just reminders of what we've lost, they're also guides for what we might preserve. The Neanderthal genes that enhance our cognitive capabilities are proof that diversity strengthens rather than weakens our species. The Denisovan variants that help us adapt to new environments demonstrate that different solutions to survival challenges can complement rather than compete with each other. But preserving diversity requires more than just recognizing its value. It requires actively protecting it against the same forces that eliminated our ancient relatives. It requires resisting the demographic and cultural momentum that drives absorption, choosing coexistence over integration when diversity is at stake. This isn't about preventing change or maintaining artificial boundaries between populations. It's about ensuring that change preserves rather than eliminates alternatives, that integration enhances rather than reduces diversity, that our success as a species doesn't come at the cost of the very variety that makes success possible. The Neanderthals and Denisovans are gone, but their genetic contributions live on in us. We are their descendants as much as we are the descendants of the Homo Sapiens populations that absorbed them. We carry their legacy in our bodies, their cognitive patterns in our minds, their adaptive solutions in our genes. This makes us the inheritors not just of their biological gifts, but of their fate. We are the species that both benefited from diversity and eliminated it, that gained strength from absorption while losing alternatives in the process. We are living proof that success and loss can be inseparable, that survival can come at costs we don't recognize until it's too late to reverse them. The 40,000-year enigma ends where it began, with a ghost in our DNA. But now we know what that ghost represents, not just the genetic remnant of an extinct species, but a warning about the price of success, a reminder of what we're capable of, both preserving and destroying. Every time you use Neanderthal-influenced cognition to solve a problem, you're drawing on capabilities that were nearly lost forever. Every time Denisovan genes help your body adapt to challenging conditions, you're benefiting from solutions that were developed by minds that no longer exist. Every time ghost population variants contribute to your survival, you're living proof that diversity strengthens rather than weakens our species. But you're also living proof of what happens when one human lineage becomes so successful that it eliminates all alternatives. You carry within your body both the benefits of that success and the responsibility it creates. You are the descendant of the absorbers and the absorbed, the survivors and the eliminated, the inheritors of both triumph and tragedy. The question that will define our future isn't whether we can avoid repeating the patterns of the past. We're already repeating them, every day, in our ongoing choices about diversity, integration, and coexistence. The question is whether we can learn to repeat them more wisely, with greater awareness of what we're preserving and what we're losing in the process. The Neanderthals can't tell us how to answer that question. They're gone, reduced to statistical patterns in genetic databases and fragments of DNA scattered through our genomes. But their ghosts can remind us that the choices we make about diversity today will echo through thousands of years, shaping the genetic and cognitive landscape that our descendants inherit. We are the only human species left, carrying within ourselves the biological memories of all the others. What we do with that inheritance, how we honour both the diversity we've gained and the alternatives we've lost, will determine whether the 40,000-year enigma ends with us or continues through us into an uncertain future. The ghosts in our DNA are waiting for our answer,